Hi, welcome to Storm Geo's video on demand spring weather presentation. I was going to say weather webinar presentation, Fred, but we're not doing webinars anymore.
Sure.
We're providing the same content, but we're doing it from right here in the Storm Geo studio. And we kind of have a treat for us today because it's not all you. All you is great when you do your presentations, but we're actually going to provide a little bit of time to Chris Hebert, our lead hurricane forecaster, to do his presentation. He recorded just yesterday or the day before the spring outlook for the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season. So your presentation starting right now is severe weather and the global patterns that are responsible for that. We'll follow it up with Chris. I think we can start Chris's presentation.
Let's get with it.
Cameron, go ahead and pull that up and let's roll Chris.
Hello, I'm Storm Geo meteorologist Chris Hebert with the April edition of our 2017 hurricane season outlook. Now, before we get into the outlook, I want to talk a little bit about some historical activity and a little bit about what happened last year. First of all, it's been quite a long period of time the last time a Category 3 or greater hurricane struck the United States coastline. In fact, by the beginning of the season here on June 1st, 11.6 years since the last time a Category 3 or greater hurricane struck the United States. And that was Wilma on October 24th in 2005. So a long period of time, longer than any other period on record, at least since the 1900 period. And looking back toward the 1850s, I haven't found anything longer than this stretch now, nearly 12 years between Category 3 or greater landfalls. Hurricane activity since 1900, this is hurricane activity in blue, and major hurricanes, 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes in the orangish color here. This is since 1900, a 10-year average of United States impact. And we can see, as far as hurricane activity, a slow decline in hurricane activity. So we're seeing less hurricane activity over the past 116 seasons. And over the past 10 years in particular, a dramatic drop in hurricane impacts across the United States. Not only in hurricanes, but as far as major hurricanes, down to zero now for a 10-year running average of major hurricane impacts across the United States coastline. Is that going to continue this coming season? Well, first of all, let's take a look at what happened last year. Last year was relatively active, an above normal season. We had 15 named storms, 7 hurricanes. 4 of them became major Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes. Not a lot of activity in the deep tropics moving into the Caribbean Sea. We had a good deal of activity across the southwestern Atlantic, a number of storms affecting the southeastern U.S., and of course we had Hurricane Matthew, which developed into a Category 5 hurricane down here near the coast of Venezuela, tracked up north past Haiti, Cuba, across the Bahamas, and then grazed the east coast of Florida as a Category 3, but it did not make landfall as a Category 3. Made landfall in the Carolinas as a Category 1 hurricane. We also had Dennis, which moved into the Gulf of Mexico and then tracked up toward the Florida Panhandle as a Category 1 hurricane as well. So we did have a good deal of activity affecting the southeastern U.S. this past season. As far as the energy last year, the accumulated cyclone energy, which is a function of a hurricane or tropical storm's intensity and its duration, such that a major hurricane like Matthew here, this is Matthew in purple, gathered the lion's share of the accumulated cyclone energy points. So Matthew, Gaston, and Nicole gathered about 73% of all the ACE points last year. Normal in a season is about 104. Last year we finished up with 135, so it was an above normal season, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of the accumulated cyclone energy out there over the basin. Well, let's take a look. Last spring, we were looking at the forecasts from the European model here of La Nina conditions. This is the ensemble members of the European model forecasting from last April, and here water temperatures forecasted drop in the tropical Pacific. All the individual members indicating a dropping of the water temperatures. There was a kind of a spread in here. The actual temperatures here that occurred is this blue dashed line, and we did see a weak La Nina last year, which tends to enhance activity in the Atlantic basin just a little bit. The forecast for this April from the European model is a bit different. We don't see any La Nina here. Water temperatures in the tropical Pacific and the El Nino region are already above normal. The forecast is for temperatures to slowly rise through the rest of the spring and into the summer. And by peak season, we may be looking at a moderate, maybe a weak to moderate El Nino this year. And there is a good deal of uncertainty for forecasting El Nino this far out. The great deal of spread from neutral conditions here to all the way to a very strong El Nino. Well, I don't think we're going to see a very strong El Nino. I think at most we might see a moderate El Nino, and we're looking at kind of a weak El Nino as the most likely scenario for this coming season, which might be a slight inhibiting factor. When we have an El Nino in the tropical Pacific, we have warm water here in the tropical Pacific, west of South America and Central America. Tends to cause more activity in this region. The air rises here in the eastern Pacific and then falls and sinks over here in the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico, and that sinking air results in drier conditions, and it's an inhibiting factor. But also when we have an El Nino, particularly a moderate to strong El Nino, we tend to have more strong westerly winds across the upper parts of the atmosphere tracking across the Caribbean Sea and tropical Atlantic. That's wind shear, when you have the winds aloft moving in one direction and the winds at the surface moving in a different direction. And wind shear is also quite an inhibiting factor as far as tropical storms and hurricanes. And if that El Nino gets up to a moderate level, then we may have increased wind shear across the Caribbean Sea and out into the tropical Atlantic. It doesn't affect the Gulf of Mexico as much when we have a stronger, moderate El Nino. We also look at the forecast for pressure across the tropics. This is the European model's forecast from August through September. Generally higher pressure, much higher pressure out here in the deep tropics between the Caribbean Sea and Africa, and that's been the case for the last 2 or 3 seasons out there, and that's one of the reasons why we haven't had too much activity developing out here in the deep tropics over the past couple of seasons. Now farther west, not as high pressure here in the western Caribbean Sea and just barely above normal pressures here in the Gulf, so I don't think it's going to be as much of an inhibiting factor across the western Caribbean Sea, Gulf of Mexico, or out here north of the deep tropics off the east U.S. coast. Now look over toward the eastern Pacific and in toward the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian Islands are right over in here. The European model is forecasting much lower pressure in the East Pacific. We'd expect that with an El Nino, and that might mean another significantly active season for our folks, our friends over there in the Hawaiian Islands this coming season. Have to watch out for that. The European model also is predicting rainfall or lack thereof across the Caribbean Sea and deep tropics. The brown areas are lower than normal rainfall amounts. When we have lower than normal rainfall amounts, it's because we have higher pressure, we have sinking, drier air, and that reduces the rainfall across the deep tropics here. No effect here really in the western Caribbean Sea up through the Gulf of Mexico or north of Cuba and the Caribbean Sea out here off the southeast U.S. coast. I don't think there'll be any activity or any lacking of activity in those areas this coming season. But also look over here toward the East Pacific and over here toward Hawaii. Those are the Hawaiian Islands right in here. Much above normal precipitation indicates they might be seeing another significant season there over in the Hawaiian Islands. They've been very active there the past couple of years. Finally, the European model predicts where the storms might track, where they're most likely to track and where they're least likely to track. If we look across the Atlantic, we see reduced activity, reduced tracks between the Caribbean Sea and Africa, but near normal conditions from the central Caribbean Sea to the Gulf and off the southeast U.S. coast. And over here toward Hawaii, look at that, increased activity likely over here near the Hawaiian Islands. Water temperatures are important because water temperatures can determine the potential intensity of a hurricane, not so much whether or not they're going to form. We still have below normal water temperatures out here across the eastern Atlantic off the coast of Africa. High pressure is relatively strong, causing some upwelling of cooler water here near Africa. Relatively normal water conditions and water temperatures across the Caribbean, but significantly above normal water temperatures across the western and northern Gulf of Mexico. Didn't have much of a winter across the Gulf of Mexico, across the deep south in general this past season, and that's why the water temperatures are well above normal across the Gulf Coast and off the southeast U.S. coast this year. Doesn't mean we're going to have more storms form in that region, but it means that if something does move into that region, then we could see it higher intensity than we normally would. And one final tool that we want to look at as far as predicting what's going to happen this season is the analog years. And an analog year is when we look back to a previous season and find one that has maybe a similar setup going from La Nina to El Nino, similar steering patterns, similar setups of high and low pressure across the Atlantic basin. And from that we can determine that, well, maybe this coming season, if it matches what we saw ahead of these analog seasons, it might be somewhat similar. And these are the years that we have determined are most close to what we're seeing right now across the tropics. And my coworker, Fred Schmude, I've been working with Fred nearly 30 years now. He's come up with these years here. And we'll go through some of these seasons and see what happened during these years to get an idea of where they might develop and how many storms might develop. As you can see, it ranges from very active in 1969 with 18 named storms, 12 hurricanes, and 5 major hurricanes, down to 2009, only 9 storms, 3 hurricanes, and 2 of those major hurricanes. The accumulated cyclone energy up to 158 in 1969, but as low as 53 in 2009. So the analog seasons are kind of all over the place and not helping us a great deal in determining the numbers. But in average, if we look at all of them, they're pretty close to a normal hurricane season. About 12, 6, and 2 is normal. 12, 6, and 7, and about 3 is what the analog seasons would suggest. Let's take a look at some of those analog seasons and see what happened. In 1951, well, we had about 14 named storms. A lot of them out here across the southwest Atlantic, but east United States coastline, turning off to the north across the Bahamas, grazing the east coast, but no real impact on the east coast. We did have a couple of hurricanes in the Caribbean. One of them made it all the way across the Yucatan into Mexico, fairly strong storm, but really not much activity across the central and northwestern Gulf. A tropical storm affected southwestern Florida in 51. 53, another relatively active season, about 14 named storms there as well. We did have 3 hurricane impacts in 1953, one of them into the Carolinas here, one into southwest Florida, and a fairly strong storm moved up into the panhandle of Florida. Again, not much activity across the northwestern Gulf of Mexico in this analog season. 1963, 10 years later, a good deal of activity again north of the Caribbean. A couple moved into the Caribbean. Now I'm questioning whether this year will be similar to 63 in that I don't think we're going to see a lot of development here moving through the Caribbean. We might see the development farther west in the Caribbean this year. But if you look toward the Gulf of Mexico, we see that we did have one hurricane that moved into the upper Texas coast, into the Houston-Galveston area. This is the only analog season, I believe, that indicated any risk to the northwestern Gulf, or suggested any risk to the northwestern Gulf. In 1969, the most active season in any of the analogs. Again, a lot of activity out here north of the Caribbean. No real long-track storms moving into the Caribbean Sea. We did have Category 5 Hurricane Camille that formed in the northwestern Caribbean Sea in August, moved right up here into southeast Louisiana and Mississippi, and that was the strongest hurricane ever to hit that area up until Katrina hit the area. It caused more damage, even though it was only Category 3 when it moved ashore in 2005. So very active 1969. Still nothing from central Louisiana westward to Texas in 1969. 2002, I remember a couple of storms from 2002. There was Isidore, which formed here south of Cuba, became a very intense storm, moved into the Yucatan Peninsula, wound around there for a couple of days, and expanded into a very large tropical storm when it tracked northward up into the central Gulf Coast, caused a good deal of flooding across the Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama coastal areas. And we also had Lily that formed in early October, became a Category 4 hurricane in the north central Gulf, weakened to a Category 1 before it moved inland into central Louisiana coast, though. So fairly active across the western Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico. We did have a weak tropical storm affect the Texas coast in 2002. Now finally, 2009, relatively quiet season, very quiet across the Caribbean. No long track storms making it into the Caribbean. One fairly strong hurricane out here in the open ocean that ran into Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And we did have Hurricane Ida developed in the western Caribbean Sea in November. Very late storm. Moved northward, weakened to a tropical storm, then briefly became a hurricane just off the southeast Louisiana coast, and then weakened to basically a disturbance before it reached the Gulf Coast. So very unusual storm there. Again, no real significant threats from central Louisiana westward. So the analog seasons and the other seasonal predictors are kind of a mixed bag this year. For an active season, we do have very warm water in the western Caribbean, and particularly across the Gulf of Mexico. Some of those analog seasons were quite active, but on the minus side, for an inactive season, we have high pressure, again predicted to be in the tropics, particularly between the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. Below normal rainfall predicted in the deep tropics, again, might inhibit development from the Caribbean Sea over toward the coast of Africa. And the biggest uncertainty is how strong that El Nino might be this year. If it gets a little stronger, then it might reduce the activity from our forecast just a little bit. And speaking of our forecast, let's take a look at what we're forecasting now. We're looking at a fairly close to normal season, a little bit above normal. 12 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 3 major or Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes this coming season. Now, where are they most likely going to affect? Let's take a look here at our map. The blue shaded area here is where we think that there's a reduced risk of impact, and that might well extend all the way up to Puerto Rico in here. But I think that we're not going to see any long track storms or strong storms moving into the eastern Caribbean because of the sinking in dry air in that region. But I do think that development will occur farther west, and if they do occur farther west, then we're going to see some activity possibly threatening the Gulf or the southeastern U.S. coast. So quiet down here. The most active area I think is going to be north of the deep tropics up through this region here. where they'll track either out to sea or perhaps graze the East Coast. Now, my co-worker of many decades, Fred Schmude again, we're talking about what's going to be the pattern along the east U.S. coast, and he thinks a low pressure is going to set up along the east coast during the hurricane season. And what that means is the jet stream will be coming in from the southwest over in this region, which could potentially steer storms heading toward the southeastern U.S. to the north before they reach the east coast. So that would be good for you folks along the east coast. Now, we can't guarantee that's going to happen with every storm out there, but in general, the pattern may be one to steer them away from the east U.S. coast. Of course, that doesn't protect you from systems that might be developing down here in the northwestern Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico, because we think that it's going to be relatively favorable in this region. If we can get a strong disturbance in that region, we think that we could be seeing a strong hurricane develop there. Typical tracks from the analog seasons indicate either off to the north and then northeast, perhaps threatening the Florida Panhandle to the peninsula, maybe could cross Florida and then threaten the east U.S. coast from that direction, and possibly developing in the Caribbean and tracking westward into Mexico. Now, we certainly couldn't rule out any impact to Texas this far out, but the analog seasons would suggest that perhaps they might track more toward Mexico, and with the low pressure developing over here, we may have high pressure sitting over the mid-U.S. continent here, and that could keep systems that move into the Gulf either turning westward into Mexico or just on the eastern side of that high, tracking up toward Florida. So that's what we think is going to happen this year. As far as the names this year, this is the list, same list as 2005 and 2011. We had Dennis retired in 2005. Now that's Don. We had Katrina retired. Now that's Katya. Rita was retired. The new name is Rena. And Wilma was retired in 2005. The new name for that storm is going to be Whitney. I don't think we're going to make it all the way down there. More likely somewhere up in this area as far as the name list for this year. Well, that's a look at the forecast for this year. For this April, I'm storm geometeorologist Chris Hebert. Thank you for viewing.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great presentation. Fred, I think the key takeaway is mixed signals. On the one hand, we have 1969 with 18 storms, including Hurricane Camille.
Right.
But on the other hand, we've got many seasons that have very low numbers.
And the key to that is going to be the El Nino. If we see that stronger El Nino develop, we're going to wind up probably struggling to make 9, 10 storms. But if we see a weaker El Nino, that can actually sometimes aid in hurricane development because it produces what we call ventilation. So it actually clears the atmosphere and produces a favorable environment. So right now we're tending to think close to normal. It's just something we're going to have to monitor very closely.
Keep our eye on.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course it is April, so we still have a month and a half before hurricane season officially begins,
starts.
Even though we have a subtropical system that just
Absolutely. So it's an indication to be on
pay
the
attention.
lookout. Absolutely.
Exactly, pay attention. And with that, we're going to wrap up this video. Thanks so much for joining us. Again, I'm Senior Meteorologist Dave Gorham for Storm Geo, alongside Fred Schmude, our Senior Scientist for Long Range Weather Prediction. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.